My eyes observe, my mind interprets, and my heart guides my brush. That is how I produce my portrait paintings. And now, in today's episode, I would like to present you with a strategy for success. The grisaille, which is a monochromatic underpainting, is going to be our first stage out of 4 in this strategy for success. And I'm using just titanium white and ivory black oil paint, a little bit of odorless mineral spirits, and the medium for this stage is going to be liquid. So I've completely covered this 11 by 14 inch panel with a thin coat of ivory black with a tiny bit of liquid. Now I'm going to start this painting a little bit backwards. So traditionally in an academic painting, you would start off with a transfer drawing. That is drawing the contours very carefully and then transferring the outlines. We can do that in another episode. But in this episode, you're seeing now how I'm starting directly with paint. So even though we're going to be using a layered approach, we're going in with direct painting for the grisaille. Now that we have a large shape covered for the face, now we're going to start to put in some more of the light shapes surrounding the face. Now when you're layering with oil paint, typically you want to layer lighter. So that is, I'm allowing myself to let straight titanium white be my drawing color for those light shapes. Now with a little bit of the ivory black, a little bit of odorless mineral spirits, and liquid, I'm now starting to put in some of the dark shapes for the hair. Now grisaille in particular is a type of underpainting where you're using black and white. Bear in mind that black and white, that is ivory black and titanium white, you could use flake white if you like, but in any case, this underpainting in particular will take much longer to dry than a typical underpainting that you will see me do usually with, say, burnt umber. The reason for the black and white grisaille is to establish the entire tonal range right from the beginning. Ivory black can get extremely dark, I'd say very much near the darkest you can possibly get with oil paint, and titanium white can pretty much get the lightest you can possibly get. And as I was saying earlier, layering lighter is the way you want to approach, because when you add on successive layers of color, as you'll see later, it's actually easier to layer them in darker. And now we're going to draw some of the interior shapes just using ivory black thinned out with a little bit of odorless mineral spirits, and again the tiniest bit of liquid to get this layer to dry. Now before I go any further, if you've been doing research into classical oil painting or oil painting in general, you've probably come across the notion fat over lean, the term fat over lean. Now the terminology fat over lean corresponds to the way that you layer paintings. So traditionally you want your painting to have less mediums in the first layer, so less medium in the first layer, and then as you continue to add more layers you want to have more and more medium. Now to talk about fat over lean a little bit more, as you're seeing how I'm starting to draw in with a very simple type of style, just outlines, simple shapes, trying to place the eyes. Now again, fat over lean means you want the first layers that you have in your painting to dry faster than your next layers. So you don't want the layers underneath to still be halfway drying. So I would recommend still using a medium. That is, whether you're using stand oil or liquid or other mediums that we'll get into later on. It is important to thin out the paint with the odorless mineral spirits and learn how to balance your ratio of mineral spirits to medium. That's something that can be learned through the practice of physically mixing the thinner, the medium, and the paint on your palette. And if you're new to painting, don't stress out too much about fat over lean. Just make sure that each layer is completely dry before you add on the next layer. And just make sure that you use a little bit more medium to your mixtures in the later stages, and you don't need to worry much more about the fat over lean than that. Now, with the painting, what we're doing is we're building straight titanium white into the lightest areas of the face. And so with the grisaille, it is alright to make the lights pretty much titanium white. The white of the eye, which I usually say is not white, you can actually make pretty much white with some subtle halftones, say as the light is turning across the form of the eyeball. And even here, as you're seeing, we're starting to build up the white. Now, I did make a little painterly trick here. Remember, I toned the surface with the ivory black before going in with the white. That actually helped me with the blending, so to speak, of the halftones. Now, in your grisaille, the most important thing to focus on is your drawing, your linear drawing, your shapes. You want to make sure that your shapes are as accurate as possible to ensure that you have a surface that you can continue to build with successive layers of color. And after you're dead set on your shapes, then it's important to prioritize light and shadow with maybe just a few little halftones in between. And that's about it for the first day's effort on this grisaille. So now we're going to move on to the next stage, which is local color. Now the next thing I want to talk about is, when is your painting ready for the next layer of color? So touch dry doesn't necessarily mean the painting is completely dry. When you feel the surface of the painting, if there's any kind of softness or soft texture on the surface of the painting, then that means that the painting is not completely dry. Now, in the first stage, I made a very big mistake in the layering of the painting. I used a lot of ivory black in the background and in the halftones. Now, I suggest in your underpainting, after watching this, if you want to do your underpainting in black and white, thin out your ivory black much more than I did. I painted much more thick than I needed to. I should have made it thinner, ensuring that the painting or the underpainting was completely dry. Even after about 3 days, I think it was, from the underpainting to this stage, the painting was still a little bit questionable in terms of its dryness. Now, you just saw the color mixtures for the flesh tones, and this stage is titled local color. So let me first define local color for you. Now, the way I define it is to be the most basic, or say average, color of a given area. Other artists also refer to this stage as dead coloring, but I don't like the term dead in painting, so I don't really like to use the term dead color. But if you want to look up more information on these types of techniques, this is traditionally called dead color layer. Now, as these forms are starting to develop on the face, I'm thinking about planes and structures, just like I've talked about in many other videos that I've uploaded. You've always heard me talk about planes and planes with respect to the light source and all of that. Now, if you're new to this channel, remember, a plane is just a three-dimensional concept of a flat sheet in space, meaning each area that's lighter is facing the light more. Each shape that is darker within the lights is just a plane that's facing the light a little bit less. Now I want to introduce another term into my dialogue that I have here with these narrations, and I'm going to call this learning to see in sequence. So learning to see in sequence. So with each shape in the local color stage, you want to keep as I mentioned before, you want to keep the colors rather simple. You don't want to focus too much on color variation just yet, but try as much as you can to fully model out the form. Give it your all. Try to make each form as accurate and as dimensional as possible. Now, learning to see in sequence is going to apply in each layer. So try to do your best with form. That's what I'm doing here with the eye socket, and trying to roll the curvature of the eye. And then as each layer progresses, do the same exact thing, meaning go over each form again. So each day you return to your painting, you will discover something new, inevitably, that you may have missed in the day before. Now, this may be the most important bit of advice in this entire video, since this video is talking about a strategy for success. So learn how to see in sequence, and this will build your patience when it comes to painting. Patience and painting have a lot to do with time and how you manage your time when you're painting. So in the local color stage, give it your all to try to render each form and make it as dimensional as possible, knowing in the back of your mind that in the next day you will be able to return to your painting and see things that you would have missed if you were trying to work on a painting in only one day. So in that sense, you're learning how to manage your time and create more and more successful oil paintings. Now, as these forms are starting to develop rather slowly, one little point at a time, notice right there I'm actually using the back of the brush. So sometimes I actually will use the back of the brush for little tiny highlights, like what you just saw there on the pupil of the eye. Now, what I was trying to get at is with each individual layer that you're applying onto the painting, make sure that you're leaving yourself room for the next layer. So that's why I really don't, I know I mentioned this before, but don't go in with a loaded brush right away in the local color stage. And don't try to cover the entire thing and then try and little by little make it more refined. That way of painting is suitable more for alla prima painting, which is probably 90% of the YouTube videos that I have uploaded. They've all been alla prima. But this particular approach is one among many in which the final result of the painting is intended to be more realistic. And now we're going to introduce another kind of tricky topic in classical painting, or portrait painting in particular, and that is realism that is not photorealism. Now, there's nothing wrong with photorealism or trying to make a painting look 100% exactly like a photograph, but that's not what I'm trying to do with this painting. So whenever you see someone saying it doesn't look like the picture, that's usually a good thing for me, because I'm not trying to make the painting look like the picture. And that's why I said this is another tricky topic to talk about. Now, as you continue to learn more about form, you learn more about value and anatomy, you will be able to create a convincing image that is reminiscent of the beauty of nature, of your own eyes observing nature. And then interpreting that through your mind and letting that flow through to your painting is what will create a specific look. And that specific look will be what determines the characteristics of your own individual paintings. And that's very much something that at least I'm very interested in with classical paintings, you wouldn't walk around in a museum and say, wow, that painting looks just like a photograph. You would look at, say, a Caravaggio and appreciate it for the masterful execution of the painting. Or for another example, you could look at a Sargent or a Bouguereau and appreciate the masterful technique involved in the production of the artwork, not necessarily how photographic their artwork is. And now, as we've just passed the 15-minute mark and I've been speaking in pretty much the same kind of tone of voice, I'm now going to give a little bit of audio silence, or I'm going to slow down my narration a little bit just to add a little bit of variation in how I narrate the footage. And as I said, I would slow down the narration, but that doesn't mean I'll be completely quiet. Now, the next thing I want to talk about while we're still in this slowed down narration is the palette. And I, for one, consider palettes to also be a form of art and to be part of the painting process. I actually do not like using glass palettes. Which is kind of weird to say, as you've seen this type of glass palette in like 99% of my videos. I do prefer handheld palettes, and we'll probably use more of them to show you the paint mixtures more close up in the future. But that's another thing to talk about, is the way that artists use their palettes. And how that relates to the topic of success for artists is the materials. So now I'm going to transition back into the regular pace of which I'm narrating this episode. So the artist materials is another incredibly important aspect to creating successful paintings. You want to know how your materials work for you. Now, in particular, in this stage, in the local color stage, as I mentioned before, I'm painting rather thin. Okay, so fat over lean doesn't necessarily mean thick or thin paint. What it means is how much medium is used in the layer of paint. So I'm painting with a small brush in small patches of area so that I have a much thinner layer of color that will dry in a relatively reasonable amount of time. So at this stage in the painting, I believe this was the second day. We're still on the second day I was working on this painting. I was still using liquid. Eventually, I'm actually going to transition into a new medium that I've recently discovered that I now consider to be my absolute favorite medium, but we'll get into that later on in this episode. Now, as the approach to layering oil paintings in this particular way, this more classical approach, is rather time consuming in that you have to wait for the painting to dry over a pretty significant amount of time. At least 3 or 4 days is a significant amount of time for me. Here's my next tip on successful painting and successful painting, let's say successful painting habits, if you have the time to do so, I recommend to work on multiple paintings at once. Not necessarily have 2 paintings on your easel, that's not what I mean. But what I mean is, while this painting is drying, I'll let you in on a little secret. While this painting was drying, I ended up starting another painting that will eventually be shown on YouTube. And while that one was drying, I started another. So in fact, I'm working on 3 different paintings intended to be shown on YouTube at the same time. So that gives you a window of opportunity to, say, be in the grisaille stage in one painting, and then the same day work on the local color stage in another painting, or work on a drawing that you can use to transfer into another painting. And then you can fall into a cycle, a type of routine, so to speak, that allows you to continue to keep working even though you have to wait for a significant amount of time between each stage. And now I'll let you in on yet another little technical tip in terms of oil painting in particular. The shadows, or the darker darks, say the dark underneath the upper eyelid, the dark accent for the eye sockets, the shadow on the side of the nose, they actually have a lot of burnt umber in them. Why am I using burnt umber in the darks? I'm sneaking burnt umber in those colors because burnt umber is a very fast drying color. So I'm being kind of sneaky in the way I'm mixing these colors. I'm very mindful of what colors are going to dry the fastest, what colors are going to dry the slowest. So the slowest drying colors are going to be your yellows and your reds, and of course ivory black, as I mentioned before. But even the side plane of that's the side plane of the philtrum of the mouth that we just painted in there, still has quite a bit of burnt umber. And now these dark accents that we're putting in on the side of the mouth also have some burnt umber in them. And another thing you want to think about is the transparency or opacity of your oil paints. And I usually like to sneak in a little bit of alizarin permanent in the accents of the mouth and sometimes in the nose. And then if you're asking why alizarin permanent instead of alizarin crimson, to me, they are almost the same thing when it comes to painting. The physical application of the paint, for me, they feel like the same thing. Alizarin permanent is what I've been using simply because in a lot of comments I kind of get yelled at for using alizarin crimson on its own, because people have told me, this is quote unquote, it is a fugitive color, which you can read articles on it. And yes, alizarin crimson historically is, as I'm thinking of it, a fugitive color. That wouldn't matter so much if you're, layering the colors in this way. If you want your paintings to last for years and years and years and years, and you don't want the reds to fade, then of course use alizarin permanent. But if 200 years down the line doesn't bother you, alizarin crimson should be the same. That being said, I do sometimes alternate in my own studio paintings to using just alizarin crimson, the regular one on its own. And now returning to the painting demonstration, you're seeing a pattern here that has been shown in many of my other episodes, working from the eyes to the nose, then the mouth. Again, this is seen as somewhat of a taboo by a lot of other portrait painters or oil painters, and that's okay. Everyone is allowed to work in their own style that they enjoy. But I prioritize the eyes and the nose as I define them as the main triangle, simply because eyes are much more difficult to adjust or to move if I get them wrong. The nose is a little bit more difficult to adjust than the mouth. And the chin is much, much, much easier to adjust than, say, the eyes or the nose. So I'm working in the order of, I don't know what the word is, the order of importance. I'm looking at the most difficult things first. And then as I'm painting throughout the day, if I tend to fatigue, which I do, it's a normal thing to get fatigued after working for a certain number of hours on a single painting, then I'd rather be fatigued while I'm painting, say, the chin or the mouth than the eyes or the nose. And now I'm going to give you another tip for success. And this doesn't necessarily apply to everyone, but I would suggest working on a painting no more than 3 or 4 hours at a time. And then if you're like me and you work full-time painting, alternate between paintings. I usually work on 3 different paintings on the same day. So I usually will work around 10 hours each day, albeit rather on either I'm editing on the computer or uploading to YouTube or painting, usually around 10 hours. And it helps me to alternate between paintings. That may help you if you tend to fatigue, like I do, when you're working on the same painting for more than 3 or 4 hours. Alright, and now I'm going to slow down the narration a little bit, but as I slow down the narration again, I would like to talk about the flesh tone mixtures that I've been using. So, the flesh tones are a very simple combination of the titanium white, flake white, yellow ochre, cadmium red, and burnt umber. And pretty much those colors make up the majority of all the flesh tones in the light. In particular, you can either go more pink or more orangey, depending on how much red to how much yellow ochre you use in the flesh tones. And that's pretty much it. Now I'm going to slow down the narration to add variation to the pace at which I narrate this episode. And there you're seeing the burnt umber. A little tiny bit of burnt umber and yellow ochre is what gave me that nice little subtle kind of brown greenish shadow. Burnt umber, yellow ochre. And there you're seeing the brush move very rapidly. And again, that's because I'm trying to have a very, very soft edge. And I'm not trying to paint with a loaded brush. That's why the brush movements are quite rapid. And like I said, if I want it to be more pink, the more pinkish mixtures have a little bit more of the cadmium red and flake white. And in particular, with the 2 whites that I'm using, if you're wondering why I have titanium white and flake white is a lead-based white that has this property, of which it allows me to use more of it without raising the value too much, allowing me to have a thicker mixture of paint, or also allowing me to make something a very subtle transition lighter without sacrificing the color harmony too much. And again, with the yellow ochre and burnt umber combination for those more subtle halftones, you're now seeing how we're starting to cover all of the dark shadows with a kind of more earthy, muted dark tone. And now we're going to finish up covering all the way up to the top of the forehead. And now let's transition into the regular pace of the narration. As you see there, I'm starting to paint the eyebrows directly on. I did paint over the eyebrows first, and then I went over in a kind of direct painting style to put a little bit of variation into the eyebrows, but that's just how I paint eyebrows. Now with the hair, again, burnt umber. And why am I using burnt umber? You may know, because I've been saying it dries faster. And in this case, it's exactly what I wanted for the first layer of color for the hair. I decided to go kind of more warm and then add the cooler colors on top of this in the next stage. And the hair, the blonde hair, if you're interested, there are many different ways to achieve the color for blonde hair, but I just decided yellow ochre, flake white, and burnt umber would do the trick. And now we're just going to layer on some of these colors for the shoulder and the clothing. But again, I'm not going to finish these areas quite to the same extent as the forms for the face. And again, with the yellow ochre, burnt umber type of color. And now we're going to transition into the next day of painting and the next stage. And this is modeling. Modeling refers to the development of form onto the painting. And now I'm using a completely different medium. And as promised earlier, I'm now going to explain my new favorite medium, which is the little thing that you're seeing on the side of the palette. That medium is Rublev's Venetian medium. Rublev's Venetian medium. So Rublev is the brand, and the name of the exact medium is Venetian medium. It is composed of a little bit of turpentine, powdered glass, and lead, among other things that is in this medium. The important thing to note is that Rublev is not paying me to say any of this. This is something I just happened to discover while I was walking around in the art store. Venetian medium is a fast-drying medium, but what I have discovered is that it adds a type of body, a type of texture to the paint that is incredibly solid and makes the surface of the painting look much more solid, in my opinion, than Neo McGilp or Liquin. And it does dry pretty quickly, so it doesn't sacrifice the drying time as well. And add to that, I'm now using turpentine, traditional turpentine, which is a much stronger, thinner than odorless mineral spirits. I decided to use that simply because, again, the Venetian medium already had turpentine in it, and it just made sense for me to do that. But if you do use turpentine or lead-based materials like I'm using, such as the flake white, just don't eat your materials, and I'm pretty sure you'll be just fine. And if you want to use turpentine, just make sure you have a well-ventilated room. And that's all you need to worry about. And it may sound kind of harsh, and I apologize if it was harsh when I said don't eat your materials, just because I get a lot of comments and remarks on lead-based materials for oil painting. Lead has been used in oil painting for centuries. It's been used for a long time, and there's a reason for it. Lead itself, I don't know enough about materials to tell you exactly why it does this, but lead in the oil paint, it just makes the film, the body of the oil paint, just feel much more solid. And now, as you're seeing here, I'm trying to show you the paint mixtures close up, with that smaller palette. As you saw, again, I actually went right into the burnt umber and yellow ochre. I really enjoy holding palettes. For me, it makes me feel more connected to the process of creating paintings. Now, for the layering of this painting, I decided not to oil out the painting. Remember, in my previous videos, I would cover the entire thing with medium to bring back the colors that had sunken in after, the painting had completely dried. Excuse me. This time, I didn't oil it out. Instead, I'm modulating my mixture of thinner to medium so that I have an application of paint that has more medium in it. But at the same time, I'm building the color without adding any extra oil to the painting, thus ensuring that there isn't an excess of medium or oil on the final layers of the painting. And as you're seeing, I'm building from the darks, so the colors did sink in a little bit, or as others have written, faded. So some of the colors did fade, but instead of oiling the entire thing out, I decided to, like I said before, I won't repeat myself, so I'm going from the major planes, the major dark planes of the face, and I'm starting to develop more form. And as I mentioned before, learning how to see in sequence, I'm now seeing much more specificity for the structures than I saw the day before. So it's allowing me to have a much more refined touch to each one of these forms. Now going over every form exactly the way I did before. And that is just going from the dark planes and modeling my way around. See how I kind of reinforced the shape, the shadow shape on the side of the nose. The little curve on the side of the bulb of the nose, I didn't see it as well the previous day. I didn't see it as clearly the day before, or the previous day I had worked on this painting. And now I'm going in with much more clarity into all of these shapes. And this stage, the modeling stage, can be done in multiple layers. The modeling stage doesn't necessarily have to be one day. In fact, I recommend you spend multiple days on the modeling stage. And modeling is a much more conceptual task. So you have to picture how form is turning on the surface of each area of the painting. You have to conceptualize it as you paint these structures. And there I'm trying to show you firsthand how to mix those colors. So again, burnt umber, ivory black. Nothing more complicated for those shapes. There I'm using more ivory black into the puddle that had more burnt umber, adding a little bit more Venetian medium, thinned out with a little tiny bit of the turpentine. And now we're just layering a much darker accent. And we're going to do the same thing with the hair. So again, a lot of this was repetition, going over the same shapes on the face. As you see, the hair now has much more refinement. And hopefully you can tell, if you're watching this video in high quality, that that medium does add a very nice surface to the oil painting. Now let's move on to the next stage, refinements. Now refinements you can think of as, suppose this was a still life painting. Refinements for me would be like painting in very thin glazes for, say, if it was an apple, the little tiny spots, tiny little sparkles on the apple would be glazing. Now this is going to be pretty much completely glazing for this stage. And what I'm doing on the palette here is I'm trying to create the color value web by kind of trying to remix the same type of colors that I had mixed before. And now, as I said, this is going to be the refinement stage. So this is pretty much the final touches. So I'm going in with very thin glazes. And now the combination of paint, turpentine, and Venetian medium is such that I have sort of like a thin layer of colored glass. Now you're seeing a close-up on the palette just how thin these colors are. Now I'm going in with a semi-transparent application of oil paint over each area. Once again, going over everything on the face yet again to have a much more refined mark in each area. Now I highly suggest that you do your refinements in thin glazes so that if you make any mistakes in your refinement or you add something you don't like, a glaze is much easier to wipe off with a dry brush if you're not satisfied with the tiny adjustments that you make. And yes, throughout some of the footage, you did see some of my paintings in the background. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. My studio is starting to become kind of cluttered. But in any case, I really hope that today's episode helps you out. If you would like to see more painting videos such as this one, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you would like to support this channel even more, I have a link to my Patreon account. If you would like to purchase any paintings from me or take classes with me, I have all of that information listed in the description box down below. And it's now time for our new patron shout out. So thank you so much, Arthur Leet, and thank you so much, Michael Stemper. I hope I can pronounce your names correctly. Thank you so much for your support on my Patreon account. It truly means the world to me. I wish you the best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you on the next episode.